So in this section, we're going to focus on graphing square root function. Before we actually get into the work of graphing, we have to first find the vertex when you're given a function or given an equation. So here, we're going to identify by following the same rule as we have been doing for cubic, absolute value, and quadratic. So in order to find the vertex, the rule for x coordinate and then the rule for the y coordinate, same as before, which is opposite x for the x coordinate and then same y for the y coordinate. So again, once you apply this rule, it's going to be easy to identify the vertex when you're given any kind of equation or given any kind of function for square roots. So looking at example 17, so we have m of x equals the square root of x plus 6 and then plus 2. So I'm applying opposite x, so opposite of positive 6 will be negative 6 for my x coordinate. And then applying the rule of same y, which is the plus 2 that's outside behind the square root. So plus 2, that means that it's going to be a positive 2 for the y coordinate. So my vertex for example 17 will be negative 6, comma, positive 2. Moving on to example 18. So we have p of x equals the square root of x minus 5 and then minus 9. So I want to apply opposite x at the minus 5 since it's right inside and behind the x. So opposite of negative 5 is going to be positive 5 for the x coordinate. And then I'm going to apply the same y on the minus 9 since the minus 9 is outside behind the square root. So since it's minus 9, then it's going to be a negative 9 for the y coordinate. So therefore, my vertex is going to be 5, comma, negative 9. So once you understand how to find the vertex, then you basically finish the first step for graphing a square root function. So moving on to this example, we have the function h of x equals the square root of x plus 4 and then minus 3. So applying the rule for finding vertex opposite x and same y, then my vertex will be negative 4, comma, negative 3, which what we have right here. So once you identify the vertex, now this one's going to be very similar to quadratic. So for graphing square root, the vertex that you find, that's going to be the first coordinate point you're going to put in the first row of your XY table. And then for this one, you're essentially finding 3 coordinate points. But since we already found the vertex, we found the first coordinate point. Therefore, we just need to do the work for the next 2 coordinate points. So, like I said before, once you find the vertex, you're going to put it as the first row of the XY table, shown right here. Now, for this one is different to finding x values compared to cubic, cubic, absolute value, and quadratic. When working with square root, we have to be very careful on which x value to use. And again, the reason is when you're working with x value, what number that you have, what single number that you have inside the square root, it has to be able to be square rooted, meaning that you can only have perfect square numbers. So what I mean by that is that one number that is equal or a singular number that you have inside the square root has to be a perfect square number. And the reason it's a perfect square number is because you're able to do the square root of a perfect square number. So that's why you're going to do the work as shown right here. Here I have x plus 4, which is the inside of the square root, and I said equal to 1. And then I did another one, x plus 4, and then set it equal to 4. Now the reason, and I'm going to circle these two. Now the reason I chose 1 and 4 is because these two are perfect square numbers. And since they're perfect square number, then you'll be able to do the square root, which you will see once I show you the work. So that's why we set the inside equal to two perfect square numbers. So that way, once you have it equal to a perfect square number, then you're able to do the square root, and that will go away. So let's work on the x plus 4 equal to 1. So once you solve, well, actually, once you solve for the x value for these two right here, x plus 4 equal to 1 and x plus 4 equal to 4, then you will get the next two x values, which we're going to put right here. So the x plus 4 equal to 1, when you solve for x, you're going to get negative 3. And then the x plus 4 equal to 4, when you solve for x, you're going to get x equal to 0. Now, I would suggest writing out the work so that way you can get the proper x value. I have seen in the past where students didn't write out the work, they did it in their head, and they ended up with the wrong x value. So when they enter with the incorrect x value, when they plug it in, then they end up with a number that you cannot do the square root of. So that's an issue if you're trying to graph square root function without using a calculator. So without using a calculator, you have to be very, very careful on which specific x values that you're going to use for the xy table. So after doing the work and solving for the two x values, I'm going to basically put those two x values here, which is going to look like that. Now, once you determine the two x values that you're going to use to make your coordinate points, what we're going to do first is the x equals to negative 3. So we're going to do the work by plugging negative 3 into the function. So here's the work. So since we're finding the y value, we're doing h of negative 3. I simply plug in negative 3 into the x. Now, inside the square root, we have negative 3 plus 4. So when you simplify by following order of operation correctly, we're going to end up with a positive 1 inside the square root. So here, again, it's always best that you try and make the number inside the square root become a perfect square. So make sure you have a singular perfect square number inside the square root. If you do not, for example, if you have a square root of 2, or a square root of 3, or a square root of 11, with a calculator, if you were to do a square root of any of those numbers, you're going to end up with a decimal. So that's going to be very hard to graph with a decimal number. Hence, the importance of making the inside of the square root come out as a perfect square number. And in this case, since we have a square root of 1, which you can do, the square root of 1 is 1. So since we're solving, we just only need to find just the one root, which is the positive root. So positive 1. Now here, I have included parentheses. So again, the square root of 1 is 1 with parentheses. And the reason I incorporate parentheses is in the event if you have a number that's outside the square root or a negative sign, make sure to distribute so that way you want to get the right number. So in this case, since we do not have a negative or number to distribute, then I'm just going to drop the parentheses and bring down to 1. Hence, we have 1 minus 3. And again, don't forget about the last number that you have. If you do, you will end up with the wrong y value, and then your graph is going to look incorrect, or it's not going to look as what a square root graph looks like. So at this point, I have 1 minus 3, which will come out as negative 2. So this will be my y value for x equals to negative 3. So I'm going to put in negative 2 into the table, just like that. Next, we're going to work on the last x value, which is x equal to 0. And here's the work. So I'll plug in 0 into x, follow the order of operation. So I'm going to simplify the inside of the square root. So 0 plus 4 is 4. And just like I said before, now we have a square root of a perfect square number, which we can do. And the square root of 4 is positive 2. So again, we know that doing the square root, we always have two numbers. But in this case, we're only going to be using the positive number when it comes to graphing. So when you do the square root of 4, you're going to have positive 2 with parentheses, just in case if you have to distribute from the outside a negative sign or a number. In this example, we don't have to worry about distribution, so I can drop my parenthesis and then bring down the 2. Don't forget about the minus 3. So at this point, I have 2 minus 3, which will come as negative 1. So I'm going to put negative 1 into my XY table, and it's going to look like this. So once you have finished finding all your corner points, now we can start plotting them onto the graph. So when you plot it on the graph, you're always going to start with the vertex, and then follow through with the second corner point and the third corner point. And it's going to look like this. So here's my vertex at negative 4, negative 3. And then my second point is at negative 3, negative 2, which is right here. And then my last corner point is 0, negative 1, which is right here. And again, you have to have 3 points. If you don't, then you will not have a proper square root graph. So once these 3 corner points are plotted, then what you're going to do is you're going to start at the vertex, follow through to the second point, and then follow through to the last point. So when you do that, your graph is going to look like this. So this is what a typical square root graph looks like. So again, it's very similar to quadratic, where the vertex is the first corner point, and then you must write out the work, set the inside equal to 1 and 4, the perfect square numbers, to get the correct x values, because again, you do need correct x values to determine the correct y values to help determine the correct corner points for your graph. If they're not correct, then your graph will look funky and it won't be similar, or it won't look closely to a square root graph. So make sure you keep that in mind. Make sure you memorize the rules and the process.